The fire had already been lit when Grace Whitmore was dragged into the center of the village square, and she knew, from the way the flames cracked against the frozen night air, that this was not a fire meant to warm anyone. Snow fell in fat, slow flakes, catching the orange light and turning gold before it hit the ground. Grace's wrists were free, but her arms were held tight by two guards she had known since childhood, men who would not meet her eyes. Around her, the entire Frostmore pack had gathered, their faces lit by torchlight, their whispers sharp as knives. "She poisoned the stores," someone hissed from the crowd. "Half the pack is sick because of her." Grace opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat had gone dry the moment she saw the healing hall doors thrown open, the shelves of medicines scattered across the floor, and 12 pack members lying pale and shivering on cots. She had spent 3 days trying to save them. She had barely slept, and now she stood accused of causing the very sickness she had been fighting to cure. At the front of the crowd, on a raised platform of packed snow, stood Nathaniel Ashford, the Alpha King of Frostmore. He wore no crown, only a heavy black coat lined with fur, but there was no mistaking the authority in his stance, the way the entire pack seemed to lean toward him, even in silence. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they finally found Grace's, held something she had never seen in them before. Regret. But regret would not save her tonight. "Grace Whitmore," Nathaniel said, and his voice carried across the square without needing to be raised. "You have served as healer of this pack for 6 years. Tonight, you stand accused of poisoning our winter stores, causing sickness in 12 of our people, 2 of whom may not survive until morning." "I didn't do this," Grace said, finally finding her voice. It came out steadier than she felt. "I would never harm anyone in this pack. You know me, Nathaniel. You know I wouldn't." A murmur rippled through the crowd at her use of his first name, but Grace didn't care anymore. 6 months ago, that name had meant something between them. Quiet conversations after council meetings, a hand brushing against hers when no one was watching, promises neither of them had spoken aloud but both had understood. Now his expression didn't change. "The evidence says otherwise," said a voice beside him. Colin Ashford, Nathaniel's younger brother, stepped forward, his arms crossed, his face carefully arranged into something like sorrow. Her fingerprints were on the tainted herbs. "Her ledger shows she ordered the very ingredients that caused the reaction. I am sorry, Grace. I truly am." Grace stared at him, and for one terrible second, understanding cracked through her like ice breaking beneath a boot. Colin had been in the healing hall 3 nights ago. She remembered now. Remembered him offering to help her restock the shelves while she rested her eyes for just a moment. Remembered waking to find the herbs already sorted, already labeled in her own hand because he had asked her, kindly, to show him how she wrote her ledger entries so he could learn the craft. He had used her own writing against her. "You did this," Grace whispered, so quietly only Colin could hear. "You switched the herbs." Colin's eyes flickered, just for a moment, something cold and satisfied passing behind them, before the mask of sorrow returned. "Grief makes people say strange things," he said, loud enough now for the crowd to hear. "I understand you are frightened, Grace, but the truth must come first, even when it hurts." Grace turned to Nathaniel, desperate now, searching his face for any sign that he saw what she saw, that he understood his own brother had done this, and was now standing in the snow, letting her take the blame. "Nathaniel," she said, "please, you have to believe me." For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind picked up, sending flurries of snow sideways across the square, and somewhere behind Grace, one of the sick pack members coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made the crowd shift uneasily. "The council has voted," Nathaniel finally said, and his voice had gone flat, distant, the voice of a king rather than a man. "2 of our people may die tonight because of what happened in that healing hall. The pack needs someone to answer for it. The pack needs to trust that justice has been served." "So you're going to punish me for something I didn't do," Grace said, "because it's easier than finding out who really did it." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face then, quick as lightning, gone before anyone else could have noticed it. But Grace saw it. She saw the doubt. She saw that somewhere beneath the mask of the Alpha King, the man who had once pressed his forehead to hers in the quiet dark of the healing hall knew, or at least suspected, that she was telling the truth. And still, he said nothing to stop what came next. "Grace Whitmore," Nathaniel said, louder now, so the whole square could hear. For the crime of poisoning the pack's winter stores and endangering the lives of our people, you are hereby cast out from Frostmoor Pack. Your mark will be removed. You will leave these lands before sunrise and never return." The crowd erupted, some voices calling out in anger, others in confusion, a few, quieter ones, in something like pity. Grace barely heard any of it. The two guards holding her arms tightened their grip, and she was pulled forward toward the platform, toward the ancient stone basin where pack marks were given, and, apparently, taken away. The removal of a pack mark was not something Grace had ever witnessed before. She had heard stories, whispered ones, about how it felt like fire beneath the skin, how the mark itself seemed to fight against being torn free, because it had grown into a person's very soul over the years. She had never believed those stories were literal. She believed them now. An elder Grace barely recognized, an old woman with silver hair and clouded eyes, pressed both palms against the small crescent moon mark on the back of Grace's neck, the mark she had carried since the day she was born into this pack, the mark that had connected her to every person standing in that square whether they liked her or not. The pain that followed was unlike anything Grace had ever felt. It was not simply physical, though her knees buckled and a scream tore from her throat before she could stop it. It was as if something was being ripped out of her chest, some invisible thread that had tied her to this place, to these people, to the only home she had ever known, and now that thread was being cut, strand by strand, until nothing remained. When it was over, Grace collapsed into the snow, gasping, her vision blurring at the edges. The mark on her neck was gone, replaced by raw, reddened skin that would scar. She could feel the absence of the pack bond like a hollow space where her heart used to be. She looked up, through tears she hadn't realized were falling, and found Nathaniel's eyes one last time. He did not look away, but he did not stop it either. "Get her a cloak," he said quietly to one of the guards, his voice cracking just slightly on the last word. "She'll freeze before she reaches the border otherwise." It was the smallest kindness, a single cloak thrown over her shoulders, as two guards half-carried, half-dragged her toward the edge of the village, past the frozen fields, toward the tree line that marked the border of Frostmoor territory. Grace's legs were shaking too badly to walk on her own. Her chest still burned where the mark had been. Behind her, she could hear Colin's voice rising above the crowd, something about justice being served, about the pack being safe again, and she wanted to scream at all of them that they had just banished an innocent woman, while the true culprit stood among them accepting their gratitude. But no one would have listened, not tonight. At the edge of the trees, the guards stopped. One of them, a young man named Henry, who had once brought Grace a broken arm to set when he was barely more than a boy, hesitated before letting her go. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the wind. "I don't think you did it. I don't think anyone really does." "Then why did no one say so?" Grace asked, her voice hoarse from screaming. Henry didn't answer. He simply stepped back, and the guards turned and walked away, leaving Grace alone at the edge of the forest, with nothing but a thin cloak and a wound on the back of her neck that throbbed with every heartbeat. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind had picked up into something closer to a storm. Grace looked back once, at the lights of Frostmoor glowing warm and distant through the trees, at the home she had spent her entire life building, the healing hall she had filled with careful hands and careful hearts, the people she had saved more times than she could count. None of it belonged to her anymore. She turned away and walked into the trees, because there was nothing else left to do, and because some small, stubborn part of her refused to lie down in the snow and simply wait to die, even though every part of her body screamed that this was exactly what would happen if she kept walking. The forest swallowed her whole within minutes, the trees so thick that the lights of the village disappeared entirely, replaced by nothing but darkness and snow, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. The cold seeped through the cloak almost immediately, biting at her fingers, her face, the exposed skin at the back of her neck where the mark used to be. Grace didn't know how long she walked. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment the fire had been lit in the square. She only knew that her legs eventually stopped obeying her, that the snow beneath her feet seemed to rise up to meet her, rather than the other way around, and that the last thing she remembered before the darkness took her completely was the sound of something moving through the trees nearby, footsteps that were not her own, growing closer with every passing second. She did not have the strength left to be afraid. Before the darkness fully claimed her, a memory surfaced, uninvited, sharp and clear as glass. It was late summer, months before any of this had happened, and she had been sitting on the healing hall steps after a long day, exhausted, her hands stained with crushed herbs. Nathaniel had found her there, sat down beside her without a word, and simply stayed as the sun went down over the fields. "You work too hard," he had said finally. "Someone has to keep this pack alive," she had answered, smiling despite herself. "I keep this pack alive," he had said, nudging her shoulder with his own. "You keep it healthy. There's a difference." She had laughed then, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in years, and he had looked at her in a way that made her chest ache with something she didn't yet have a name for. Later, much later, after the council meetings ended and the fires in the great hall burned low, he would find reasons to walk past the healing hall, to linger in doorways, to ask questions about herbs he clearly already understood, just to hear her explain them again. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that whatever was growing between them was strong enough to survive anything. She had been wrong. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold, biting reality of the forest floor beneath her, the snow gathering on her eyelashes, the growing numbness in her fingers that no longer felt like her own. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, low and mournful, and Grace thought, with strange clarity, that it might be the last sound she ever heard. The footsteps she had noticed earlier grew louder, crunching steadily through the snow, unhurried but deliberate, as though whoever approached had already known exactly where to find her. Grace tried to turn her head, tried to force her eyes open, but her body no longer answered her commands. A shape moved through the darkness above her, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs that had seen many winters. Still breathing, a low voice muttered, more to itself than to her. "Good. That makes this easier." Grace felt herself being lifted, strong arms sliding beneath her shoulders and knees, the warmth of another body a shock against her frozen skin. She wanted to ask who he was, wanted to ask why a stranger would bother saving a woman who had just been cast out by her own pack, marked as poison, as danger, as someone not worth the trouble. But the darkness pulled her under, before she could ask anything at all, and the last thing she registered was the steady rhythm of footsteps carrying her deeper into the forest, away from Frostmoor, away from everything she had ever known, toward a fate she could not yet begin to imagine. Whether it would be kinder than the one she had just escaped, only time would tell. Heat. That was the first thing Grace registered. A heat so sudden and complete that for a moment she thought she was still dreaming, still trapped in the memory of a summer evening on the healing hall steps. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to firelight instead of snow. She was lying on a narrow cot inside a small wooden cabin, thick furs piled over her body, the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs filling the air. Her fingers, when she flexed them, ached with the particular pain of frostbite that had been caught just in time. She was alive. She was also not alone. Across the cabin, a man sat on a low stool, sharpening a knife against a whetstone with slow, practiced strokes. He was younger than she had expected, though his face carried the kind of weariness that made him look older. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled back from his face, eyes the color of storm clouds that flicked up toward her the moment she stirred. "You're awake," he said, setting the knife aside. His voice was the same low, rough voice she remembered from the forest. "I wasn't sure you would be." Grace tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, a wave of dizziness forcing her back down against the furs. "Where am I?" "Somewhere safe," the man said, "for now." That's not an answer. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "No, I suppose it isn't." He rose from the stool and crossed the small room, crouching beside the cot to press the back of his hand against her forehead, checking for fever with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before. "You're lucky. Another hour out there and there would have been nothing left for me to find." "Why did you help me?" Grace asked. The question had been sitting in her chest since the moment she opened her eyes. "You don't know me." "I could be exactly what they said I was." The man's eyes hardened, just slightly. "I know Frostmoor justice better than you might think. I've seen what it looks like when the pack decides someone is guilty before they've even finished asking the question." He stood, moving to a small fire pit in the center of the cabin, to stir something in a pot hanging above the flames. "My name is Ethan Hale. I was cast out of that same pack 6 years ago, for refusing an order I should never have been given in the first place." Grace studied him carefully. There was no mark on the back of his neck either, she realized. Only a faint scar, where one used to be. Similar to the raw wound she could still feel beneath her own hair. What order? Ethan's jaw tightened. That's a story for another night. Right now, you need food and rest, not more talk of Frostmore. He ladled a thick, herb-scented broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to her, waiting patiently as she forced her shaking hands to hold it steady enough to drink. The warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time since the fire had been lit in the square, Grace felt something other than pain. How long have you lived out here? She asked between careful sips. Long enough to know how to survive it, Ethan said, settling back onto his stool. Long enough to build a life that doesn't depend on anyone's forgiveness. Is that what I'm supposed to do now? Grace asked quietly. Build a life out here, alone, waiting for the day the pack remembers I existed? Ethan's expression softened, just slightly, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something closer to understanding. You don't have to be alone, not unless you want to be. Grace didn't answer that. She wasn't sure what to say to a stranger who had saved her life, and now seemed willing to share whatever small safety he had built in this frozen wilderness. Instead, she finished the broth in silence, watching the fire crackle and pop, trying not to think about the healing hall she would never see again, or the 2 sick pack members she had left behind, or the look on Nathaniel's face when he had said her name for the last time, as her king, rather than as the man who once sat beside her on warm summer evenings. Over the following days, Grace's strength slowly returned. Ethan's cabin was small but well stocked, tucked into a hidden hollow between 2 rocky hills that broke the worst of the wind, far enough from any pack territory that neither Frostmore nor any of their rival packs would think to look there. He taught her, without being asked, which plants in the surrounding forest could be used for food, which tracks in the snow belonged to prey, and which belonged to predators best avoided, how to set simple snares that would keep them fed through the leanest parts of winter. In return, Grace found herself falling back into old habits, tending to a cut on Ethan's arm from a hunting mishap, correcting the way he had been treating a persistent cough with the wrong combination of herbs, reorganizing his haphazard collection of medicinal supplies into something resembling the careful order she had once kept in the Frostmore healing hall. It felt strange, almost cruel, to find comfort in the very skills that had gotten her banished in the first place, but it was comfort all the same, and she had learned quickly that comfort, in this new life, was not something to be taken for granted. You still think about them, Ethan said one evening, nearly 2 weeks after he had found her. They sat outside the cabin, despite the cold, watching the last light fade behind the hills, wrapped in enough furs to keep the chill at bay. The pack, your king. Grace didn't bother denying it. Is it that obvious? You get a certain look, Ethan said. I used to get it too, in the beginning, wondering if they'd realize their mistake, wondering if someone would ride out to bring you back and set things right. Did anyone? Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Ethan's laugh was short and humorless. No one came for me. Took me almost a year to stop expecting it. He glanced sideways at her, something unreadable in his expression. You should prepare yourself for the same. Kings don't often admit their mistakes, even when they know they've made them. He looked at me, Grace said quietly, the memory still sharp, despite everything that had happened since. In the square. Right before he said the words that cast me out, he looked at me like he already regretted it. Regret and action are different things, Ethan said. I learned that the hard way. He stood, brushing snow from his coat. Come inside. It's getting colder, and there's no use freezing over a man who chose his crown over you. Grace followed him back into the cabin, but his words lingered long after the fire had been banked for the night, long after Ethan's breathing had evened out into sleep on the other side of the small room. She thought of Colin's careful, satisfied expression as he had accused her in front of the entire pack, and she thought of the sick pack members she had left behind, wondering if they had survived, wondering if anyone had thought to check the herbs Colin had truly used, rather than the ones he had blamed on her. Somewhere out there, the truth was still buried beneath lies, and Grace knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it would not stay buried forever. Truth, she had learned over 6 years of tending wounds, both physical and otherwise, always found its way to the surface eventually, no matter how deeply someone tried to bury it. The question was only whether it would surface in time to matter, or whether, by the time Frostmore discovered what Colin had truly done, Grace would have already built a life so far removed from that pack that the truth would no longer hold any power over her at all. She fell asleep that night with that thought turning over in her mind, the fire casting long shadows across the cabin walls, the wind howling outside, as though it too were searching for something it had lost in the vast, unforgiving winter dark. Morning brought fresh snow and, with it, a visitor neither of them had expected. Ethan was the first to hear the approach, some instinct honed from years of solitary survival, pulling him upright, before the crunch of footsteps outside the cabin became audible even to Grace. He moved to the door with the knife he had been sharpening the night Grace arrived, positioning himself between whatever waited outside and the cot where Grace still lay half wrapped in furs. The knock that followed was hesitant, almost apologetic, nothing like the forceful demand Grace might have expected if Frostmore had somehow tracked her down. Ethan opened the door a careful crack, and Grace watched his shoulders relax slightly at whoever he found standing there. "Simon," he said, though his voice remained guarded. "It's early for a trading run." The man who stepped into the cabin's doorway was older, weathered by years on the road, a heavy pack slung across his shoulders and snow dusting his gray beard. His eyes found Grace immediately, and something like recognition flickered across his face. "You're the healer," he said. "From Frostmore, the one they cast out." Grace's stomach tightened. Word travels fast. Word travels faster when two more pack members die of the same sickness a week after they banished the person they blamed for it, Simon said, setting his pack down heavily by the door. Sickness that, by all accounts, has nothing to do with poisoned herbs at all. The cabin fell utterly silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the distant howl of wind outside, and Grace felt something inside her chest shift, cold and sharp, like ice beginning, finally, to crack. "Tell me everything," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please, I need to know." Simon lowered himself onto the stool Ethan offered, warming his hands by the fire before he spoke again. "I was passing through Frostmore territory 3 days ago, to trade salt for furs, as I do most winters. The whole village was in an uproar. 2 more of the sick pack members had died in the same week, despite every remedy their new healer tried. A young man, barely past his training, has been given your old position, and from what I heard in the tavern, he's terrified out of his mind that he'll be blamed next if he can't stop whatever is happening." "Did they find out what caused it?" Ethan asked, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Not officially," Simon said, "but there's talk. Quiet talk. The kind people only share after a few too many drinks. Talk that the herbs used to treat the pack that winter came from a batch that had been resorted just before the sickness spread, resorted by someone other than the healer everyone blamed." Grace's breath caught. "Colin." Simon shrugged, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected as much. "I don't know names. I only know what I heard, but the tavern keeper's wife, who works cleaning the healing hall 3 days a week, says the shelves were rearranged the night before everything went wrong, and the healer they banished had no part in that rearranging." "That's not proof," Ethan said quietly, though his eyes had softened as he looked at Grace. "Tavern talk isn't the same as truth brought before a council." "No," Grace agreed, her mind already racing ahead, piecing together what this meant, what it could mean, if she let herself hope for anything at all. "But it means the truth is starting to surface on its own, even without me there to defend myself." Simon nodded slowly. "There's more, if you want to hear it." Grace's stomach tightened. "Go on." "The Alpha King," Simon said, glancing between Grace and Ethan, as though gauging how much this information mattered to the pair of them. "Nathaniel Ashford. Word is he hasn't been himself since the banishment. Barely speaks in council meetings. Spends most of his time alone, or riding the borders of the territory as though searching for something, though no one seems to know what or who." Grace said nothing, though her chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, watching her reaction carefully, but he too remained silent, letting Simon continue. "There are rumors he's sent scouts beyond the border," Simon added. "Quiet ones, not official pack business. No one knows exactly what they're searching for, but plenty have guessed." "He wouldn't," Grace murmured, though even as she said it, she wasn't certain whether she believed her own words, or simply hoped they were true. "He made his choice in that square. He chose the pack's safety over the truth. Kings make many choices, Simon said, gathering his pack once more and rising to his feet. Not all of them stay made once the guilt sets in. He offered Grace a small, sympathetic smile. For what it's worth, healer, most of the pack doesn't believe you did what they said you did. Fear makes people do foolish things in the moment. It rarely stops them from regretting it later. After Simon left, trudging back out into the snow with promises to return within the month with more news from his travels, the cabin settled into a heavy, thoughtful quiet. Grace stared into the dying fire, turning over everything the traitor had said, weighing hope against caution, memory against the harsh reality of what had actually happened in that square only weeks before. "You're thinking about going back," Ethan said eventually, not quite a question. "No," Grace said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I need to know the truth comes out, Ethan. Not for my sake alone. Those two who died deserved better than dying from a sickness someone else caused, while everyone believed the wrong person had already been punished for it." Ethan studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "Then we make sure it does come out, one way or another." Grace looked up at him, at the quiet steadiness in his storm-colored eyes, and felt, for the first time since the fire had been lit in the Frostmore Square, that she was not entirely without allies in whatever came next. The winter around them stretched on, cold and unrelenting. But somewhere beneath the frozen ground, the truth was already beginning to stir, and Grace intended to be there, however far from Frostmore she might be, when it finally broke through the surface for good. The scream tore through the night before Grace even had time to open her eyes fully, jolting her upright on the cot, with her heart hammering against her ribs. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in the healing hall, back among the sick pack members she had left behind. But the sound came again, closer this time, unmistakably human, and unmistakably in pain, somewhere in the trees beyond the cabin. Ethan was already at the door, knife in hand, his body coiled with the tension of someone who had survived on instinct alone for 6 long years. "Stay here," he said, but Grace was already pulling her boots on, refusing to be left behind, not after everything she had learned about herself in the weeks since her banishment. "I'm a healer," she said simply. "If someone's hurt, I need to help." Ethan didn't argue, though his jaw tightened with clear reluctance. Together they moved out into the frozen dark, following the sound of ragged breathing through a thin stand of pines, until they found her, a young woman, barely more than a girl, collapsed against a tree trunk, with blood soaking through a crude bandage wrapped around her leg. "Please," the girl gasped, flinching as Ethan approached, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the simple pain of her injury. "Please don't send me back. I can't go back there." "No one's sending you anywhere," Grace said gently, kneeling beside her despite the cold seeping through her knees, already assessing the wound with careful hands. It was a deep gash, likely from a trap of some kind, badly infected from what looked like days of neglect. "My name is Grace. This is Ethan. We're going to help you, but I need you to stay calm while I look at this properly." The girl's name, they learned as Grace worked to clean and rebind the wound back at the cabin, was Lucy, and she had fled her own pack territory nearly 2 weeks earlier after her alpha had decided she was too weak to be worth feeding through a harsh winter, a common enough cruelty in packs less fortunate than Frostmore had once been, though Grace supposed she no longer had any right to speak of Frostmore's fortune with anything but bitterness. "You're safe here," Grace told her, once the wound was properly cleaned and Lucy's fever had begun, slowly, to break under a careful mixture of herbs Grace had gathered over her weeks in the forest. "No one is going to hurt you." Lucy's eyes, still glassy with exhaustion, fixed on Grace with something like disbelief. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because someone should have helped me too," Grace said quietly, "and no one did." It was in that moment, watching Lucy finally drift into an exhausted but peaceful sleep, that something shifted in Grace's understanding of what her exile could become. She had spent the past weeks mourning everything she had lost, the healing hall, the pack, the man who had once looked at her like she mattered more than his own crown. But watching Lucy's breathing even out, watching the fear slowly drain from the girl's face as the fever broke, Grace realized that her skills, her knowledge, her stubborn refusal to let anyone suffer without at least trying to help, had not been taken from her at all. Only the pack that had once housed them had been taken, and perhaps, Grace thought, That pack had never truly deserved what she had to offer in the first place. "You have that look again," Ethan said the next morning, watching her from across the cabin as she prepared a fresh poultice for Lucy's leg. "The one that means you're planning something." "There will be more like her," Grace said, not looking up from her work. "More people cast out, more people running from packs that decided they weren't worth the trouble of keeping. If Lucy found her way to us by pure chance, others will too, eventually." "You want to build something," Ethan said, understanding dawning in his expression. "Here, a place for people like us." "Is that foolish?" Grace asked, finally meeting his eyes. "To think 2 exiles and an injured runaway could build anything worth having, out here in the middle of nowhere, with no pack protection and no guarantee of survival past the next hard frost?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and Grace watched him consider the question with the same careful weight he gave to everything: the tracking of prey, the mending of tools, the slow, cautious trust he had extended to her since the night he found her half frozen in the snow. "I think," he said finally, "that the packs who cast us out believed we needed them more than we needed ourselves. I think proving them wrong might be the finest thing either of us could do with the years we have left." Over the following weeks, word of the healer in the hidden hollow began, slowly, to spread. Grace never knew exactly how it traveled, whether through Simon's trading routes or through the whispered network of other exiles scattered across the neutral lands between territories. But travelers began to arrive with increasing frequency, some seeking healing, others simply seeking shelter, all of them carrying stories of packs that had failed them in one way or another. There was Clara, a sharp-tongued woman in her 30s, who had been cast out after refusing to bond with an alpha she did not love, and who arrived at the cabin with nothing but a satchel of stolen coin and an impressive skill, with a bow that made hunting far easier than it had ever been, with only Ethan's traps to rely on. There was Edward, an older man whose pack had abandoned him when age slowed his hunting past the point of usefulness, who turned out to have hands skilled enough with wood and stone to begin construction on additional shelter as the small hollow's population grew beyond what one cabin could hold. By the time the worst of winter had passed, what had begun as a single hidden cabin had grown into something resembling a small settlement, 5 structures now clustered together in the sheltered hollow, each one built by hands that had once belonged, in one way or another, to packs that no longer wanted them. Grace found herself busier than she had ever been, in Frostmore's healing hall, tending not just to physical wounds but to the deeper injuries that came from rejection, from banishment, from the particular grief of losing a home that should have protected you instead of casting you out. She listened to stories long into the night, held hands through fevers and nightmares alike, and slowly, without quite realizing when it had happened, became something more than a healer to the small community growing around her. She became someone they trusted enough to lead. "You could call yourself an alpha, you know," Clara said one evening, watching Grace organize the settlement's growing stores of medicine with the same careful precision she had once brought to the Frostmore Healing Hall. "Half the people here already look to you that way." "I don't want a title," Grace said, though the words felt strange in her mouth, as though she were still trying to convince herself as much as Clara. "I just want a place where no one has to be afraid of being cast out again." "That," Clara said, smiling faintly, "sounds exactly like what an alpha should want, whether you call yourself one or not." Grace didn't answer, though she thought about Clara's words long after the other woman had gone to bed, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling of the cabin she now shared with 3 others who had once been strangers and were now, in every way that mattered, something closer to family. She thought of Nathaniel, of the crown he wore, that had once seemed to mean protection, and now seemed, more than anything, to mean the willingness to sacrifice the innocent for the sake of appearing strong. She thought of the settlement growing around her, built not on bloodlines or ancient pack law, but on the simple, radical idea that no one deserved to be thrown away simply because they had become inconvenient. And she thought, for the first time since the fire had been lit in the Frostmore Square, that perhaps this exile was not the ending she had once believed it to be. Perhaps, instead, it was only the beginning of something far larger than the healer she had once been, something Frostmore, in all its cruelty and fear, would have never allowed her to become. Outside, the first hints of spring were beginning to show themselves in the melting edges of the snowbanks, and Grace stood at the door of her cabin, watching the pale morning light spread across the hollow she now called home. wondering, with something that felt dangerously close to hope, what news the coming thaw might carry with it from the pack that had once cast her aside. That hope was tested only days later, when Edward came rushing back from a routine check of the hollow's outer boundary, his weathered face pale beneath his gray beard. "There's someone out there," he said, catching his breath against the doorframe of Grace's cabin. "Watching the settlement. He's not moving closer, just watching, from the ridge above the tree line." Grace's pulse quickened. "Frostmore colors?" "Hard to say for certain," Edward admitted, "but he's dressed for travel, not for hunting. And he's been there since dawn, from what I could tell." Ethan was already reaching for his knife, his expression hardening into the same wary alertness Grace remembered from the night they first met. Could be a scout, could be nothing more than a lost traveler. "Or it could be someone sent to find me," Grace said quietly, and the words settled over the small gathering that had formed near her cabin door. Clara, with her bow already strung, Lucy watching from behind Edward with wide, frightened eyes that told Grace the girl had not yet stopped expecting cruelty from the world beyond their hollow. "I'll go look," Ethan said, quietly. "If it's trouble, we'll know before it reaches the settlement." Grace shook her head, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "No, I'll go. If it is someone from Frostmore, they're not looking for the settlement. They're looking for me. Better I face it directly than let it find its way here and put everyone else in danger." The argument that followed was brief but fierce, Ethan insisting he would not let her walk into potential danger alone, Grace insisting that whatever answers waited on that ridge belonged to her to find. In the end, they compromised, as they had learned to do in the months since Grace's arrival, walking together toward the tree line while Clara and Edward kept watch over the rest of the settlement. The climb up the ridge took the better part of an hour, the melting snow making the ground treacherous underfoot, and by the time they reached the top, whoever had been watching had already gone, leaving behind nothing but a single set of footprints leading away toward the north, back toward the distant, unseen borders of Frostmore territory. "Someone was definitely here," Ethan said, crouching to examine the tracks more closely. "And whoever it was, they knew enough to leave before we arrived. That's not the behavior of a lost traveler." Grace stared northward, toward lands she had once called home, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something caught between fear and a hope she had told herself, repeatedly, not to indulge. "Do you think it was Nathaniel's people?" "I think," Ethan said carefully, rising to his feet, "that if it was, it means someone in that pack still cares enough to look for you, whether or not they've admitted it to themselves yet." Grace said nothing to that, though the thought stayed with her for the rest of the day, settling into the same quiet corner of her mind, where she kept every memory of Nathaniel's face, in the moment before he had condemned her, the regret she had seen there, the kindness of the cloak he had ordered thrown over her shoulders, even as he let the pack tear her mark away. Whatever the watcher on the ridge had wanted, they had left without answers, without confrontation, without revealing themselves at all. But Grace understood, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable in her chest, that this would not be the last time Frostmore's shadow fell across the quiet life she had built in this hidden hollow. Spring was coming, and with it, she suspected, came reckonings she was not yet certain she was ready to face. The Healing Hall ledger felt heavier than it should have, as Nathaniel Ashford slammed it down onto the council table, the sharp crack of leather against wood, silencing every voice in the room at once. "Explain this," he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made even the eldest council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Explain to me why the herbs that killed 2 more of our people last week came from a batch that was resorted 3 days before Grace Whitmore was banished. Resorted according to this ledger, by someone who was not Grace at all." The young healer who had taken over the hall in Grace's absence, a nervous man named Peter, barely out of his training, stood frozen at the edge of the room, having brought Nathaniel the discovery only an hour earlier, his hands still trembling with the weight of what he had found buried in the older records. Colin sat at the far end of the table, his expression carefully neutral, though Nathaniel had spent enough years beside his younger brother to recognize the faint tightening around his eyes that always preceded a lie. "I don't know what you're referring to," Colin said smoothly. "Perhaps the ledger was miscopied. Grace was known to be careless in her final weeks, distracted, perhaps even sabotaging her own records to cover her tracks. She was distracted, Nathaniel said, because she was working herself past exhaustion, trying to save this pack from a sickness someone else caused. He opened the ledger to the marked page, sliding it across the table so the entire council could see the handwriting recorded there. Meticulous, careful, nothing like the desperate scrawl of someone trying to hide a crime. This is not Grace's hand, Colin. Every healer in this pack knows her writing. This entry belongs to someone who was taught to imitate it. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Nathaniel could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every council member's gaze shifting between the two brothers, waiting to see which one would break first. It was Peter who spoke next, his voice shaking but resolute. There's something else, my alpha. Something I found in the storage room behind the healing hall. He produced a small cloth bundle, unwrapping it with careful hands, to reveal a set of herbs that had clearly been ground and mixed, in a manner distinct from Grace's usual methods. These matched the composition that caused the sickness. They were hidden behind a loose board in the storage room. I only found them because the board had been disturbed again, recently, as though someone had gone back to check on them. Colin's composure finally cracked, a flash of something cold and calculating crossing his face, before he schooled his features back into practiced innocence. This is absurd. Anyone could have planted those herbs there. Anyone could have forged that ledger entry. Are you truly going to take the word of an untrained boy over your own brother? I am going to take the word of evidence, Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone quiet now, quiet in the way that had always frightened Colin more than shouting ever could, even when they were boys. Evidence that has been sitting in that storage room for weeks, waiting for someone brave enough to look for it properly. He turned to the council, addressing them directly now, though his eyes remained fixed on his brother. I banished an innocent woman. I let this pack believe she poisoned our people, when the true cause of that sickness sat among us, this entire time, wearing the face of grief, while 2 more of our people died from his negligence, or worse. You can't prove intent, Colin said quickly, his voice rising for the first time. Even if the herbs came from my hand, it could have been an accident, a mistake in preparation. That's not the same as poisoning anyone. Then explain, Nathaniel said, why you offered to help Grace restock the shelves that night, and why you specifically asked her to demonstrate her handwriting in the ledger, days before the sickness began. Explain why you were so quick to accuse her the moment our people fell ill, without waiting for any investigation at all. Colin had no answer for that. The silence stretched again, longer this time, until finally, one of the eldest council members, a stern woman named Margaret who had served Frostmore's council for longer than Nathaniel had been alive, spoke into the quiet. We banished the wrong person, she said simply, on the word of the man who caused the very crime we punished her for. The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical thing, and Nathaniel felt something inside his chest crack open. Guilt he had been carrying since the moment he had spoken the words of banishment in that snow-filled square. Guilt that had only grown heavier. With every week Grace remained gone, with every sleepless night he had spent wondering if he had made the gravest mistake of his life. Take him to the holding cells, Nathaniel said quietly, unable to look at his brother any longer, until we determine the full truth of what happened, and what justice looks like for it. Colin was led away without further argument, his earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by a sullen silence that told Nathaniel everything he needed to know about his brother's guilt, even without a full confession. Once the council chamber had emptied, Nathaniel remained alone at the long table, staring down at the ledger that had unraveled 6 months of carefully constructed lies. He thought of Grace's face in the moment before her banishment, the desperate plea in her eyes, the way she had said his name, as though she still believed, even then, that he might find a way to save her. He had not saved her. He had let the pack's fear override his own judgment, had convinced himself that punishing someone, anyone, was better than admitting he did not yet have answers, and in doing so, he had cast out the one person who had ever made him believe leadership could be something gentler than mere survival. My alpha, Peter said quietly, still standing near the door, clearly uncertain whether he should have already left. What happens now? Will you send word to bring her back? Nathaniel closed the ledger slowly, his fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. I don't know if she'll come, he admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. An Alpha King admitting uncertainty to a healer barely out of training. I don't know if she should, after everything this pack allowed to happen to her. But you'll try, Peter said, not quite a question. Nathaniel looked up, and something in his expression must have answered clearly enough, because Peter simply nodded and slipped quietly from the room, leaving Nathaniel alone, with the weight of a decision he had already begun to make in the quiet hours of every sleepless night since Grace had disappeared into the winter forest. He would send scouts, quietly at first, discreetly enough not to draw attention or false hope before he had anything solid to offer her. He would find where she had gone, whether she still lived, whether whatever life she had built in her exile had left any room at all for the pack, and the man who had failed her so completely. And if he found her, he would not simply send word through a messenger or a formal decree of pardon delivered by strangers. He would go himself. He would kneel in the snow if he had to, would lay bare every regret he had carried since that night in the square, and would offer her whatever she needed to believe that Frostmoor and its king could still be worth trusting again. Whether she would accept that offer, Nathaniel did not know. He only knew that he owed her the chance to refuse it to his face, rather than let her carry the weight of Frostmoor's betrayal alone for the rest of her life, while he remained safely distant behind his crown and his council chamber walls. Outside, the first true signs of spring were beginning to show themselves, across Frostmoor's fields, snow melting into muddy earth, the promise of new growth pushing up through ground that had spent months frozen and unyielding. Nathaniel intended to find Grace before that spring fully arrived, whatever the cost to his own pride, whatever truth he might have to face about the man he had become, in the moment he let fear override everything he had once felt for her. Before he could set anything else in motion, however, there was one conversation he could not avoid. The holding cells beneath the great hall were cold and sparse, lit only by a single torch bracketed against the stone wall, and Colin sat on the narrow bench inside his cell with his arms crossed, his earlier bravado replaced by something closer to resignation. "You've come to gloat," Colin said, not looking up as Nathaniel approached the bars. "I've come for the truth," Nathaniel said. "The full truth, Colin, not half admissions dressed up as accidents." Colin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stone floor between his boots. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier smoothness. "I never meant for anyone to die. I swear that to you. I only meant to discredit her enough that the council would question her judgment, enough that you would stop looking at her the way you did." Nathaniel's hands tightened around the bars. "You did this because of jealousy." "I did this," Colin said, finally lifting his eyes, "because I watched our father groom you for the crown, since the day you could walk, and I watched you throw away every advantage that crown could offer, the moment a healer, with clever hands and a kind smile caught your attention. I thought if she was gone, you would remember what mattered. The pack, our family's place within it, not some woman who made you forget you were meant to rule with your head instead of your heart. She made me a better leader," Nathaniel said quietly, "not a worse one, and you nearly destroyed this entire pack because you couldn't see the difference." Colin had no response to that, and Nathaniel found he had no further words left to offer his brother either, only a deep, exhausted sorrow that settled over him as he turned and walked back up the stone steps, leaving Colin alone, with whatever reckoning the council would eventually decide he deserved. By the following morning, Nathaniel had already summoned two of his most trusted and discreet scouts, a quiet, capable pair named Owen and Bridget, who had served Frostmoor's borders for years, without ever once betraying a confidence entrusted to them. "You're not to approach her," Nathaniel instructed, standing at the edge of the northern tree line as the two scouts prepared their packs for the journey ahead. "Not yet. I only need to know if she's alive, and where she's made her home, if she's made one at all. Nothing more." "And if she doesn't want to be found?" Bridget asked, not unkindly, though the question settled heavily in Nathaniel's chest all the same. "Then you'll come back and tell me that too," Nathaniel said. "But I need to know, one way or another. I can't keep ruling this pack while wondering every single night whether the woman I banished is alive somewhere out there, or whether she died in the cold because I was too much of a coward to stop what I'd already set in motion." The scouts departed within the hour, disappearing into the tree line that marked the edge of known Frostmoor territory, and Nathaniel remained behind, watching the empty space where they had vanished, for far longer than any Alpha King should reasonably linger, over the departure of two scouts on a routine mission. But this was not routine, and every member of his pack who watched him standing there, silent and still against the pale morning light, understood exactly what weighed so heavily on their king's mind, even if none of them dared to speak it aloud. Spring was coming, and with it, Nathaniel intended to bring back either an answer that would finally let him rest, or a grief he suspected he would carry for the rest of his life, however long that life turned out to be without her in it. The arrow missed Clara's shoulder by less than an inch, thudding instead into the wooden post beside her, and the entire settlement erupted into motion, before the sound had even finished echoing across the hollow. "Someone's in the trees," Clara shouted, already knocking her own bow, ducking behind the low wall Edward had built around the settlement's central well, only weeks earlier. North Ridge, moving fast. Grace grabbed Lucy and pulled her toward the nearest cabin, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the sudden chaos. They had lived peacefully in this hollow for months now, building something fragile but real out of the wreckage each of them had escaped. An attack, out of nowhere, made no sense. "Stay down," Ethan's voice cut through the confusion, low and commanding, as he moved between the cabins with the same lethal calm Grace remembered from the night he had found her half frozen in the snow. "Everyone inside, now." A second arrow struck the well's stone edge, and Grace caught a glimpse, through the gap in the trees, of two figures moving with practiced stealth along the ridge line, not attacking directly but circling, as though testing the settlement's defenses, rather than committing fully to an assault. "They're not trying to kill anyone," Ethan said, crouching beside Grace with his knife drawn, his eyes tracking the movement above them. "Those arrows aren't aimed to hit, they're aimed to be seen." "What does that mean?" Grace asked, her breath coming quick and shallow. "It means someone wants us to know they're here," Ethan said grimly. "Without starting a fight, they don't actually want to finish." The standoff lasted only a few tense minutes longer, before a third figure emerged from the tree line, hands raised, no weapon visible, moving slowly enough to make clear they meant no further harm. Grace's stomach dropped as recognition crept over her, not of the figure's face, which she didn't know, but of the deep blue tunic beneath the traveling cloak, a color reserved exclusively for Frostmore's scouts. "Frostmore," she breathed. Ethan's grip on his knife tightened, but he did not move to attack, watching the figure approach with the same wary calculation he brought to every threat. "You know them?" "I know the colors," Grace said. "That's a Frostmore scout uniform." The scout, a young woman with sharp eyes and cropped dark hair, stopped a careful distance from the settlement's outer wall, her hands still raised. "I mean no harm," she called out. "My name is Bridget. I serve the Alpha King. I was sent to find a healer named Grace Whitmore. I did not expect an ambush from your own people when we approached, and my partner fired only after believing we were under attack ourselves." Clara's bow remained trained on the scout despite the explanation. "Convenient story." "It's the truth," Bridget insisted. "We've been searching for weeks. When we spotted the settlement, my partner circled to check for hostile numbers before I approached directly. He panicked when one of your people spotted him and drew first." Grace stepped forward before Ethan could stop her, her mind racing through the implications of what this scout's presence actually meant. If Frostmore was searching for her, actively enough to send scouts this far beyond their territory, then something had changed. Something significant enough that Nathaniel, or whoever had ordered this search, believed finding her mattered. "I'm Grace Whitmore," she said, ignoring Ethan's low warning beside her. "Why does the Alpha King want to find me?" Bridget's expression shifted, something like relief crossing her features at finally having located the person she'd been sent to find. "The truth came out, healer. About the sickness. About who truly caused it." She hesitated, glancing at the tense faces surrounding her before continuing. "Colin Ashford has confessed, in part, though the council is still determining the full truth of his intentions. The pack knows now that you were innocent. The Alpha King knows." The words landed like a physical blow, and Grace found herself gripping the edge of the settlement's low wall for support, months of carefully buried hope and grief, rising to the surface all at once. "They know," she repeated quietly, almost unable to believe the words even as she said them herself. "The Alpha King has been searching for you since the truth came to light," Bridget continued. "He wanted to know first whether you were alive. Beyond that, I was given no further instructions, only to report back what I found." "And what will you report?" Ethan asked, his voice still carrying a wary edge, despite the scout's clearly peaceful intentions. Bridget looked around the settlement, taking in the cabins, the well, the small but clearly thriving community that had grown up in this hidden hollow over the winter months. "I'll report that Grace Whitmore is alive," she said, "and that she has built something worth finding, whatever the Alpha King chooses to do with that information." After Bridget and her partner departed, promising only to relay what they had witnessed back to Frostmore, without revealing the settlement's precise location, beyond what was necessary, Grace remained standing at the edge of the wall for a long while, staring northward toward lands she had once called home. "You don't have to feel anything about this," Ethan said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "The truth coming out doesn't obligate you to anything. Not forgiveness, not return, not even relief, if you're not ready to feel it." "I know," Grace said, though her voice trembled slightly with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel so strongly, a complicated tangle of vindication and grief, and something achingly close to the old hope she had tried so hard to bury over the winter months. "I just never thought I'd hear it confirmed, that they finally saw what actually happened." "Does it change anything?" Ethan asked, his tone carefully neutral, though Grace suspected the question carried more weight for him than he let on. She considered the question seriously, looking back at the settlement behind her, at Clara lowering her bow with visible relief, at Edward comforting a still-shaken Lucy, at the life they had all built together, from nothing but shared wounds and stubborn determination to survive them. "It changes what happened to me," Grace finally said. "It doesn't change what I've built since. This place, these people, this is mine now. In a way Frostmore never fully was, even when I believed I belonged there completely." Ethan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his storm-colored eyes. "Then whatever the Alpha King decides to do with the truth he's finally uncovered, you don't owe him anything in return. Not your forgiveness, not your return, not even an answer, if that's what you choose." Grace nodded slowly, though even as she agreed with him, some small, persistent part of her mind kept returning to the image of Nathaniel searching for her, sending scouts across unknown territory, refusing to simply let her disappearance become another quiet regret, buried beneath the demands of ruling a pack. She did not know, yet, what she would say if he ever stood before her directly. She only knew that the woman who would eventually face that conversation, whenever it came, was not the same woman who had been dragged into that snow-filled square all those months ago, desperate and pleading for a mercy that had never come. Whatever Nathaniel Ashford intended to offer her now, Grace intended to meet it not as the healer who had once needed his protection, but as the leader of a settlement built entirely on her own strength, her own choices, and her own hard-won understanding of exactly what she deserved. The wind shifted across the hollow, carrying with it the first true warmth of the coming spring, and Grace turned back toward her settlement, toward the people who had chosen her, and she had chosen in return, leaving whatever answer Frostmore's king might eventually receive to unfold in its own time, on her own terms, and no one else's. That evening, after the settlement had settled into its usual quiet rhythm of shared meals and low conversation around the central fire, Ethan found Grace sitting alone near the well, staring up at a sky just beginning to clear of winter clouds. "You've been quiet," he said, settling onto the low wall beside her without waiting for an invitation, a familiarity that had grown between them over the months, without either of them fully acknowledging it aloud. "I keep thinking about what I would say to him," Grace admitted. "If he ever actually stood in front of me, I've imagined it 100 different ways since Bridget left, and none of them feel right." Ethan was quiet for a moment, turning a small stone over in his hands. "When I was cast out," he said finally, "I spent the first year imagining exactly that. The moment my old Alpha would come find me, admit his mistake, beg my forgiveness. I built entire conversations in my head, arguments I would win, apologies I would either accept or refuse depending on how the mood struck me that day." "Did he ever come?" Grace asked, though something in Ethan's tone already told her the answer. "No," Ethan said simply. "He never did, and for the longest time, I thought that silence was the cruelest part of everything that happened to me, worse than the exile itself." He set the stone down, meeting her eyes directly. "But eventually I realized something. The waiting, the imagining, the endless rehearsal of conversations that might never happen, that was its own kind of exile. A prison I was building for myself, out of hope I couldn't quite let go of." "How did you stop?" Grace asked quietly. "I built something instead," Ethan said. "This cabin, this life. I stopped waiting for someone else to give my exile meaning, and decided to give it meaning myself. He glanced toward the settlement behind them, at the cabins, and the well, and the quiet lives now sheltered within this hidden hollow. Watching you do the same thing, faster and better than I ever managed alone, has been one of the strange gifts of this whole terrible situation. Grace felt something shift in her chest at his words, a warmth that had nothing to do with the small fire crackling nearby. You never told me the full story, she said, of why you were cast out. Ethan's expression grew distant, memory clearly weighing on him even now, years removed from whatever had happened. My alpha ordered me to eliminate a rival pack scout who had wandered too close to our border, unarmed, clearly lost rather than spying. I refused. I told him there was no honor in killing someone who posed no real threat, especially not for the crime of losing his way in unfamiliar territory. He shook his head slowly. My alpha called it cowardice, called it a betrayal of pack loyalty. He cast me out the very same night, in front of the entire pack, much the way yours did to you. That wasn't cowardice, Grace said firmly. That was mercy. There's a difference, and any alpha worth following should understand it. I used to think so too, Ethan said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. It took me a long time to stop wondering if he'd been right, if I really had failed my pack by refusing that order. And now? Grace asked. Now, Ethan said, looking at her with a steadiness that made her breath catch slightly. I think refusing that order was the first decision I ever made entirely for myself, rather than for the pack, or for my alpha's approval. I think it cost me everything I thought I wanted, and gave me, eventually, everything I actually needed instead. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the fire slowly burning down to embers, the settlement quiet around them, and Grace found herself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever waited for her beyond this hollow, whatever Nathaniel eventually chose to do with the truth he had uncovered, she was no longer the same frightened, desperate woman who had once believed her entire worth depended on a king's approval. She had built something here that belonged entirely to her, alongside people who had chosen her not out of pack loyalty or ancient bloodline obligation, but out of genuine trust, earned slowly, deliberately, through months of shared hardship and shared healing. Whatever came next, she intended to face it as exactly that woman, and no other. 6 wolves stood at the edge of the hollow by midday, and unlike Bridget's cautious approach weeks earlier, these newcomers made no effort to hide their numbers or their intentions. That's not a scouting party, Ethan said grimly, watching from the settlement's outer wall as the group approached, led by a broad-shouldered man in dark furs, who carried himself with the unmistakable authority of an alpha. That's a claim being made. Grace's stomach tightened as she moved to stand beside him, taking in the deliberate, unhurried pace of the approaching group, the way they spread out slightly to survey the settlement's defenses without any pretense of subtlety. Everyone inside except Clara and Edward, she said quietly. I'll meet them at the wall. You shouldn't face this alone, Ethan said. I won't be alone, Grace said, gesturing toward Clara, already positioned with her bow, and Edward standing solid and steady near the gate. But I need to be the one who speaks. If this settlement is going to survive whatever this is, they need to see a leader, not a healer hiding behind stronger wolves. The alpha stopped a short distance from the wall, his eyes sweeping over the settlement with open assessment, cataloging its strengths and weaknesses with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to conquest rather than conversation. Impressive, he said finally, for a collection of exiles and outcasts. I'm told this hollow shelters nearly 20 souls now, all without pack protection, all without proper leadership. We have leadership, Grace said, stepping forward to meet his gaze directly. You're looking at it. I'm Grace Whitmore. This is my settlement. Something like amusement flickered across the alpha's face. Damon Voss, he said, of the Ashwood pack, and I've come with a generous offer, healer. Ashwood territory borders this hollow to the east. My pack has need of skilled hands, healers, hunters, builders, exactly the sort of people you seem to have gathered here, without any formal structure or protection to keep them safe. Join Ashwood, all of you, and you'll have the security of a true pack behind you, rather than whatever fragile arrangement currently holds this place together. And if we refuse? Grace asked, keeping her voice level despite the tension coiling tight in her chest. Damon's expression cooled slightly, the friendly veneer slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. Then you remain vulnerable, healer. Unprotected against any pack that decides your people and your resources are worth taking by force rather than negotiation. I would prefer negotiation, but I won't pretend the alternative doesn't exist. The threat, however carefully wrapped in diplomatic language, was unmistakable, and Grace felt Clara shift beside her, bow drawn just slightly tighter, ready for whatever came next. This settlement was built by people who were cast out, betrayed, or abandoned by packs exactly like yours, Grace said, refusing to let her voice waver despite the fear tightening in her chest. Every person here chose this hollow because it offered something their old packs never did: safety, without the threat of being discarded the moment they became inconvenient. I won't hand that away to another alpha, simply because he arrives with a show of strength and a poorly disguised threat. Damon studied her for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to such direct refusal. You understand, he said slowly, that I could take this hollow regardless of your answer. 6 wolves against a handful of untrained exiles is hardly an even contest. Then you'll have to explain to your pack, Grace said, why Ashwood chose to attack unarmed healers and frightened runaways, rather than earn their loyalty honestly. Word travels between packs. Alpha Voss, the same way word traveled to me, about Frostmore's failures. I doubt conquest of this hollow would improve Ashwood's standing among its neighbors. For a tense moment, nothing happened, the two groups facing each other across the melting snow, and Grace held her ground despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat, to apologize, to find some safer path through this confrontation. But she had learned, over the long winter months, that safety, built on submission, was no safety at all, only a slower, quieter kind of exile. Finally, Damon's expression shifted, something almost respectful crossing his features, despite the tension still coiled between them. You're braver than most alphas I've met, he said, healer or otherwise. Ashwood has no interest in a fight that would cost us standing among the neutral territories for little real gain. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that fell somewhere between respect and warning. My offer remains open, should circumstances here ever change. But I won't force the matter today. He turned without further ceremony, gesturing for his wolves to follow, and the group retreated back toward the eastern tree line, leaving the settlement standing, tense but intact, in the pale afternoon light. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever watched someone do, Ethan said, releasing a breath Grace hadn't realized he'd been holding as he came to stand beside her. Maybe both, Grace admitted, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. But I meant every word. I won't build something safe for everyone here, only to hand it over to the first alpha who decides we're worth claiming. News of the confrontation spread quickly through the settlement, and Grace found herself facing something she hadn't quite expected in its aftermath, a settlement that no longer simply tolerated her leadership, but actively rallied around it. Clara began organizing informal defense training for anyone willing to learn. Edward doubled his efforts fortifying the settlement's outer walls, and even Lucy, still healing from wounds both physical and otherwise, began asking Grace to teach her the basics of herbcraft, determined to make herself useful to the community that had saved her. You've built something they're willing to fight for, Ethan observed one evening, watching the settlement's evening routines unfold with a kind of quiet wonder. That's rarer than you might think, even among true packs. I never wanted to build an army, Grace said. I only wanted to build a place where people didn't have to be afraid. Sometimes, Ethan said, those end up being the same thing. Word of the confrontation with Ashwood eventually reached beyond the immediate neutral territories, carried by the same network of travelers and traders that had once brought news of Frostmore's unraveling lies to Grace's cabin door. By the time the last of the winter snow had finally melted away entirely, the settlement Grace had built from nothing but her own stubborn refusal to disappear quietly had earned a name among the scattered exiles and outcasts of the region, whispered with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They called it Havenwood, a name none of them had chosen deliberately, but that had simply emerged, organically, from travelers describing the hollow where a banished healer had built a haven for the forgotten and the cast aside. Grace heard the name for the first time from Simon on one of his regular trading visits, and found herself surprised by how right it felt, how completely it captured what she had built without ever consciously setting out to build anything at all beyond simple survival. Havenwood, she repeated quietly, testing the word. It suits you, Simon said, smiling, as he unloaded his trading goods near the settlement's central well. Better than Frostmore ever did, if you don't mind an old trader's honest opinion. Grace didn't mind at all. Standing in the fading afternoon light, watching her settlement, her people, her hard-won home continue its quiet, determined growth, she found herself thinking, for the first time without hesitation, that whatever happened next, whatever news the coming spring carried from Frostmore's direction, Havenwood was hers, built entirely on her own terms, and nothing Nathaniel Ashford chose to offer could ever take that away from her again. That night, the settlement gathered around the central fire for what had become a regular evening tradition: shared food, shared stories, the slow knitting together of strangers into something resembling family. Grace watched Clara teaching a young boy named Peter, no relation to the healer back in Frostmore, how to properly restring a bow. Watched Edward and Lucy comparing notes on which herbs grew best in the rocky soil near the eastern ridge. Watched the quiet, easy laughter that had become as much a part of Havenwood as the cabins themselves. "We should have something more formal," Clara said later, once the younger members of the settlement had drifted off to sleep, and only the core group remained around the dying fire. "Rules. A council, maybe, so decisions don't rest on your shoulders alone every time trouble comes to our door." "I've been thinking the same thing," Grace admitted. "Today proved we can't simply react to threats as they arrive. We need structure. Agreed decisions about defense, about who we accept into the settlement, about how we handle packs like Ashwood if they return with less patience than Damon Voss showed us." "A council, then," Edward said. "You'd lead it, of course, but the rest of us should have a voice in what Havenwood becomes." They spent the following weeks establishing exactly that, a small governing council made up of Grace, Ethan, Clara, and Edward, with input welcomed from every settled member of the community, regardless of how recently they had arrived. It was nothing like the rigid hierarchy of Frostmore, no bloodline privilege, no ancient laws passed down without question. Every decision was discussed openly, every voice given weight, according to wisdom rather than birthright, and Grace found a strange, quiet satisfaction in building something so fundamentally different from the pack structure that had once cast her aside without a second thought. "You've built a pack without calling it one," Ethan observed one evening, watching the council disperse after a long discussion about expanding the settlement's boundary, before the next wave of exiles inevitably arrived seeking shelter. "Maybe that's exactly what Havenwood is," Grace said. "A pack built on choice instead of blood, on earned trust instead of assumed loyalty." "Better than most true packs manage," Ethan said quietly, and something in the way he looked at her in the firelight made Grace's chest tighten with an emotion she still wasn't entirely ready to name, though it had been growing steadily between them since that first night in his cabin, through months of shared hardship and quiet companionship that had slowly, carefully, become something far more significant than mere survival. She didn't examine that feeling too closely, not yet, not while so much remained unresolved between herself and the pack she had left behind. But she noticed it, the way Ethan's presence had become as steady and necessary to her as the healing work that defined her days, and she wondered, distantly, what it might mean for whatever came next, once Frostmore's shadow finally, inevitably, found its way back to her door. She did not have long to wait. Less than a week after Havenwood's council held its first formal meeting, Simon arrived on an unscheduled visit, his weathered face carrying an urgency Grace had not seen from him before. "The Alpha King is coming," Simon said, barely pausing to catch his breath. "Not scouts this time. Nathaniel Ashford himself, riding with a small escort, no more than a day's journey from this hollow." The fire crackled in the sudden silence that followed, and Grace felt every carefully built certainty she had constructed over the long winter months tremble, just slightly, at the prospect of finally facing the man whose choice had once cast her into the snow to die. The horse's hooves against the melting ground echoed through the hollow long before its rider came into view, and every member of Havenwood froze at the sound, watching the tree line with a tension that had not fully settled since Simon's warning the night before. Grace stood at the settlement's outer wall, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling, flanked by Ethan on one side and Clara on the other, bow already strung though not yet raised. She had spent the entire night rehearsing what she might say, discarding 100 different versions of the conversation she now had to face, and found, in this final moment, that every carefully prepared word had abandoned her completely. Nathaniel Ashford emerged from the trees alone, his small escort holding back at the tree line at his own command, his dark cloak dusted with the mud of hard travel, his face carrying the unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had ridden through the night rather than wait for morning. He dismounted several yards from the settlement's wall, holding his hands visibly open at his sides, the universal gesture of someone approaching without hostile intent. "Grace," he said, and her name in his voice, after months of silence, hit her chest like a physical blow. "You shouldn't be here," Ethan said, before Grace could find her own voice, stepping slightly forward, his tone carrying an edge of protective warning that surprised even Grace with its intensity. "Whatever you came to say, you can say it and leave. This is her home now, not yours to walk into uninvited." Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward Ethan, taking in the man's stance, the clear familiarity and protectiveness in his posture, something unreadable passing across his exhausted features before his attention returned fully to Grace. "I know I have no right to be here," he said. "I know nothing I say can undo what happened in that square, but I needed to see you. I needed to say this myself, not through scouts, not through messengers, not through anyone, but my own voice." Grace found her own voice finally, steadier than she expected, given how violently her heart hammered against her ribs. "Then say it." Nathaniel took a slow breath, and for a moment, the exhausted, uncertain man standing before her looked nothing like the composed Alpha King who had once condemned her in front of the entire pack. "Colin poisoned those herbs," he said. "Not by accident, not through carelessness, but deliberately. To discredit you, because he believed my feelings for you were weakening my judgment as Alpha. I found the proof myself, weeks after I let this pack tear your mark away and cast you into the snow to die." "I know," Grace said quietly. "A scout told me. Bridget." Something like surprise crossed Nathaniel's face. "Then you already know I failed you completely, that I let fear and pressure from the council override everything I actually believed about your character, everything I felt for you, because I was too much of a coward to stand against the pack's demand for immediate justice." "Why are you here, Nathaniel?" Grace asked, cutting through what felt like the beginning of a longer confession, needing to understand his purpose before she allowed herself to feel anything about his words at all. "If you already sent word through your scouts that the truth had come out, why ride here yourself?" "Because the truth alone isn't enough," Nathaniel said. "I don't want to simply clear your name through official decree and consider my debt to you settled. I came to ask you to come home, Grace, to reclaim your place in Frostmoor, publicly, with the full pack bearing witness to how wrong they were, how wrong I was. I want to make you my queen, if you'll still have me after everything I allowed to happen." The words hung in the cold morning air, and Grace felt the entire settlement go still around her, Clara's bow lowering slightly in surprise, Edward and Lucy watching from near the well with wide, uncertain eyes, Ethan beside her utterly silent, though she could feel the tension radiating from him at Nathaniel's declaration. "You want me to simply forget what happened," Grace said slowly, "because you've finally decided the truth matters enough to ride out here and offer me a crown." "I don't expect you to forget," Nathaniel said quickly. "I don't even expect you to forgive me easily, or perhaps at all. I only know that I have spent every day since your banishment understanding more clearly what I lost the moment I let the council's fear override my own certainty in you. I was wrong, Grace. Completely, unforgivably wrong. And I would spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, if you would only give me the chance." Grace looked past him, toward the small escort still waiting at the tree line, toward the horse standing patiently in the melting snow, and then back at the settlement behind her, at Havenwood, at the life she had built entirely without Frostmoor's crown, or Nathaniel's protection. "I need time," she said finally, surprising herself with how calm the words felt leaving her mouth. "Not to decide whether I forgive you. I need time to understand what you're actually asking me to give up, and whether I even want what you're offering in return." Nathaniel nodded slowly, though disappointment flickered clearly across his face. "I understand. I won't press you for an answer today. But please, Grace, at least consider it. Frostmoor needs its true healer back, and I need—" He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to what he wanted to say. "I need the chance to prove I've become someone worthy of what I once nearly threw away." He turned to remount his horse, then paused, looking back at the settlement with something like genuine wonder crossing his exhausted features. "You built all of this," he said, "not quite a question. In the space of one winter." I built it because I had no other choice, Grace said. Because staying alive meant finding a reason to keep going, and this became that reason. It's remarkable, Nathaniel said quietly. You're remarkable, Grace. You always were. I simply failed to protect that, when protecting it mattered most. He mounted his horse then, and with a final, lingering look toward Grace, one that carried more genuine regret and longing than any formal apology could have conveyed, he turned and rode back toward the tree line, his small escort falling into formation behind him as they disappeared once more into the forest that separated Havenwood from the pack Grace had once called home. The settlement remained silent for a long moment after he had gone, until Clara finally lowered her bow completely and let out a low whistle. Well, she said, that was not what I expected when Simon warned us the Alpha King was coming. Are you going to go back? Lucy asked quietly, moving closer to Grace, with the same wide, uncertain eyes she had carried since the night Grace first found her collapsed against a tree, bleeding and afraid. I don't know, Grace admitted, watching the empty tree line where Nathaniel had disappeared. I honestly don't know yet. Ethan remained quiet beside her, his expression carefully controlled, though Grace could feel the tension still coiled tight in his shoulders, could sense the questions he was clearly holding back, out of respect for whatever she needed to process in this moment. Walk with me? She asked him finally, needing, more than anything, to think through everything Nathaniel had said with the one person who had witnessed every step of the journey that had brought her to this moment, from half-frozen stranger in the snow to leader of a settlement that had somehow, against every possible expectation, drawn Frostmour's king across unfamiliar territory to beg for her return. Ethan nodded, falling into step beside her as they moved away from the settlement, toward the quiet privacy of the surrounding forest, and Grace found herself grateful, more than she could easily express, that whatever answer she eventually gave Nathaniel Ashford, she would not have to reach it entirely alone. They walked in silence for a long while, following a narrow path Ethan had cleared months earlier during one of his hunting expeditions, the melting snow giving way beneath their boots to reveal the first stubborn shoots of green pushing up through the dark earth. Grace waited for Ethan to speak first, sensing he needed as much time to gather his thoughts as she did. He offered you everything, Ethan finally said, his voice carefully neutral. A crown, a pack, a public restoration of your name before everyone who wronged you. Most people would consider that impossible to refuse. Most people didn't watch him stand silent while the pack tore my mark away, Grace said quietly. Most people didn't spend a winter learning they could survive, even thrive, without needing anyone's crown to feel whole. Ethan glanced at her, something cautious in his expression. But you're still considering it. I'm considering what it would mean to finally see justice done properly, Grace said, for those who died, for the pack that deserves better leadership than fear-driven decisions made in a moment of panic, not necessarily for myself. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Does that surprise you? No, Ethan admitted. It sounds exactly like the woman who spent a night nursing an injured stranger back to health, rather than simply protecting her own recovery. You've never been someone who thinks only of herself, Grace. It's part of why Havenwood exists at all. They walked further, the path winding along a small stream swollen with spring melt, and Grace found herself studying Ethan's profile in the pale afternoon light, searching for whatever he was carefully not saying. You have questions, she said finally. Ask them. Ethan was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. If you go back, he said, if you accept what he's offering, what happens to this? He gestured vaguely, though Grace understood he meant something far more specific than the settlement itself. To us? The question hung between them, honest in a way neither of them had quite allowed themselves to be before, and Grace felt her chest tighten with the weight of everything that single word implied. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't let myself think that far ahead, because I wasn't certain there was an us to consider until you just said it aloud. There is, Ethan said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual guarded caution. There has been for months, if I'm honest, though I told myself it wasn't my place to say so, while you were still healing from everything Frostmour did to you. Grace stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Why tell me now? Because I watched Nathaniel Ashford ride into this hollow and offer you a crown, Ethan said, and I realized, if I let you walk away without knowing how I feel, I would spend the rest of my life wondering if silence cost me something I should have fought for. He held her gaze steadily, despite what looked like genuine vulnerability behind his storm-colored eyes. I'm not asking you to choose me over Frostmore, Grace. I would never ask that. I only needed you to know, whatever you decide, that this settlement isn't the only reason I would want you to stay. Grace's breath caught, months of careful, unacknowledged feeling finally given voice between them, and she found herself reaching for his hand, without fully deciding to do so. The gesture as natural as breathing, after everything they had built together since that first desperate night in the snow. I need to think, she said softly, though she did not release his hand, about Frostmore, about what justice actually requires of me, about what I want, separate from what anyone else needs me to be. She met his eyes directly. But whatever I decide about Nathaniel's offer, know that this conversation matters to me. You matter to me, Ethan, more than I think I was ready to admit, even to myself. They stood together by the swollen stream as the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, neither of them rushing to fill the silence that followed, both understanding that whatever came next, whatever choice Grace eventually made about Frostmore's crown and Nathaniel's belated apology, this moment between them had shifted something that could not simply be undone. When they finally returned to the settlement, the sky had darkened toward evening, and Grace found herself facing not just the question of Frostmore's offer, but the deeper question of what kind of life she truly wanted to build going forward, and who she wanted standing beside her when she built it. She did not have an answer yet, but for the first time since Nathaniel had ridden away toward the tree line, she felt something closer to clarity settling over the tangled uncertainty in her chest, a sense that whatever she chose, it would be chosen fully, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms. 3 days after Nathaniel's departure, a second rider appeared at the tree line, and this time, the entire settlement recognized the deep blue uniform immediately, though the tension that gripped Havenwood was different now, curious rather than fearful. Bridget dismounted at a respectful distance, holding a sealed letter in her outstretched hand as Grace approached the wall to meet her. The Alpha King asked me to deliver this personally, she said, and to wait for whatever response you're willing to give, if any. Grace took the letter with hands that trembled only slightly, breaking the wax seal to find Nathaniel's familiar handwriting filling the page, more vulnerable and unguarded than anything she had ever seen from him during their years together in Frostmore. The letter did not simply repeat his offer of the crown. It detailed, in careful and painful specificity, everything that had happened since her banishment, Colin's formal trial before the full council, the confession finally extracted after weeks of evidence mounting against him, the punishment the council had ultimately decided upon, permanent exile rather than execution, a mercy Nathaniel admitted he had argued for, despite his own fury at his brother's betrayal. The letter spoke of the 2 pack members who had died from the sickness Colin caused, and Nathaniel's promise that their families would receive whatever support Frostmore could offer for as long as they needed it. It spoke of changes Nathaniel intended to make to the council's structure, safeguards against future rushes to judgment, a formal process requiring full investigation before any banishment could be enacted, named in the letter, without any hint of self-congratulation, simply as Grace's Law. And at the very end, in handwriting that grew visibly less steady, as though the words had cost him something significant to commit to paper, Nathaniel had written that he understood if she chose not to return, that he would honor whatever decision she made, and that regardless of her answer, he intended to see justice properly restored to her name, before the entire pack, whether or not she stood there to witness it herself. Grace read the letter twice before looking up at Bridget, who waited with visible patience, despite the awkwardness of her position as messenger between 2 people, clearly navigating something far more complicated than simple diplomacy. "Tell him I need to see the council meeting myself," Grace said finally, surprising even herself with the decision as it formed. Not to accept his offer of the crown, but to see justice done properly, and to speak, myself, about what happened, so the full truth is heard directly from the person it happened to, rather than through second-hand reports or written apologies. Bridget nodded, though curiosity flickered clearly behind her professional composure. "I'll relay that immediately. When would you be willing to travel?" "Within the week," Grace said, "if the council can arrange the proceedings by then." After Bridget departed, Ethan found Grace still standing at the wall, the letter held carefully in her hands, her expression a complicated mixture of resolve and uncertainty that he had learned, over the months, to recognize as the particular look she wore when facing a decision that mattered deeply. "You're going back," he said, not quite a question. "Not to stay," Grace clarified quickly. "Not to accept the crown, or reclaim my old position, or become anything Frostmore expects me to be again. But I need to see this through properly. Colin's trial, the truth, spoken aloud before the people who once believed I poisoned them. The families of those who died deserving to hear directly from me that I never stopped trying to save their loved ones, even after everything the pack did to me." Ethan studied her for a long moment. "And Nathaniel? Seeing him again, in front of the entire pack, after everything he said to you here?" "I don't know what that will feel like," Grace admitted honestly. "But I can't build a life going forward while leaving that chapter unfinished behind me. I need to face it directly, on my own terms, with my own voice, rather than let it remain some half-resolved wound I carry forward into whatever comes next." "I'll come with you," Ethan said immediately. Grace considered this, understanding the complicated layers beneath his offer. Protection, certainly, but also something more personal, an unwillingness to let her face Frostmore's judgment and Nathaniel's presence, entirely alone. "I would like that," she said finally. "If you're certain you're ready to walk back into the pack that cast you out too." "I stopped needing their approval a long time ago," Ethan said. "But I'm not letting you face this without someone who actually knows what you survived to build what exists now." They departed for Frostmore 5 days later, leaving Clara and Edward in charge of Havenwood's day-to-day operations, with Lucy insisting, despite her still healing leg, on accompanying them as far as the border to see them off properly. The journey took the better part of 2 days, retracing the path Grace had once stumbled along half-frozen and alone, though this time she walked it with purpose, with Ethan steady beside her, and with a settlement waiting behind her that had chosen her leadership freely, without any pressure of ancient bloodline or forced obligation. Frostmore looked smaller than Grace remembered as they finally emerged from the tree line. The village she had once called home, now viewed through the lens of everything she had built and become since her banishment. Word of her return had clearly spread ahead of their arrival, and pack members lined the paths as they approached, watching with expressions ranging from open curiosity to visible shame, though none dared approach directly. Nathaniel met them at the village edge himself, and Grace watched something complicated pass across his face as his eyes moved from her to Ethan, standing protectively close beside her, before settling back on her own steady gaze. "You came," he said quietly. "Not for the reasons you might hope," Grace said, "but yes, I came." The council chamber had been prepared for a formal proceeding, and Grace found herself standing before the same gathering of elders who had once condemned her, though this time, the atmosphere carried none of the fevered fear that had marked her banishment. Instead, there was a heavy, uncomfortable silence, the weight of collective guilt settling over the room as Grace took her place before them, Ethan standing just behind her shoulder, a steady presence she drew strength from, without needing to look back and confirm he remained there. "I want to hear it," Grace said, addressing the council directly, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet chamber. "Not the letter Nathaniel sent me, not the second-hand reports carried by scouts and traders. I want to hear, from this council directly, exactly what happened, exactly what evidence proved my innocence, and exactly what Colin Ashford has confessed to doing." Margaret, the eldest council member, rose slowly to her feet, her expression carrying none of the sharp judgment Grace remembered from the night of her banishment. "You deserve that, and far more than that," she said. "Colin Ashford deliberately poisoned the winter stores, forged evidence to implicate you, and allowed 2 innocent pack members to die, rather than confess his crime, when the sickness first spread. He has been formally exiled from Frostmore territory, permanently, with no possibility of return. The council failed you, Grace Whitmore. We acted from fear rather than proper investigation, and 2 of our own paid for that failure with their lives, while you paid for it with everything you once called home." The formal acknowledgement settled over Grace differently than she had expected. Not quite relief, not quite vindication, but something closer to a long-overdue completion, a wound finally being tended to properly, rather than left to fester beneath careful bandages of forced calm. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, "for finally saying that plainly." She turned then to address the families of the 2 pack members who had died, seated near the front of the chamber, their faces marked by months of grief, compounded by the knowledge that the true cause of their loss had gone unpunished for so long. I want you to know, Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat, that I never stopped trying to save them. I worked every hour I had left before my banishment, trying to find whatever was causing that sickness. I am so deeply sorry I couldn't save them in time, and sorrier still that it took this long for the truth of what actually happened to reach you properly. The chamber remained silent for a long moment, until one of the grieving mothers rose slowly to her feet, her eyes wet with tears that seemed to carry equal parts grief and gratitude. We know, she said simply. We always suspected the truth was more complicated than what they told us that night. Thank you for coming back to say this yourself, healer. Grace nodded, unable to trust her voice further, and it was in that moment, standing before the pack that had once cast her aside and now stood ready to finally acknowledge the truth, that she understood, with complete clarity, exactly what answer she needed to give Nathaniel Ashford about the crown he had offered her in that quiet hollow weeks before. After the council proceedings concluded, Nathaniel insisted on a public gathering in the same square where Grace's banishment had taken place months earlier, though this time the square filled not with fear and suspicion, but with a subdued, watchful hope that seemed to hang over the entire gathering. Torches were lit against the evening dark, though this time their warmth carried none of the menace Grace remembered from that terrible winter night. This pack owes Grace Whitmore a debt it can never fully repay, Nathaniel said, standing before the assembled crowd, with none of the distant, kingly reserve he had worn the night of her banishment. We failed to protect her when protecting her mattered most. We let fear override truth, and in doing so, we lost one of the finest healers this pack has ever known, while the true source of our suffering walked free among us, accepting our gratitude for a crime he himself committed. He turned to Grace then, gesturing for her to step forward, and though every part of her wanted to shrink from the attention of the crowd that had once watched her mark torn away in agony, she forced herself to stand tall, remembering everything Havenwood had taught her about facing difficulty without flinching. I cannot restore your pack mark without your consent, Nathaniel said, addressing her directly now, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. I cannot undo what was done to you. But I can, before every person gathered here, formally and publicly declare your innocence, and offer whatever restoration you're willing to accept, whether that means reclaiming your place within Frostmoor, or simply carrying our acknowledgement of the wrong done to you, as you continue whatever life you've built beyond our borders. Grace looked out at the crowd, recognizing faces she had known her entire life, healers she had trained alongside, families she had tended through countless illnesses and injuries over 6 years of dedicated service, all of them watching her now with expressions caught between shame and hope. I accept your acknowledgement of the truth, Grace said finally, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion tightening her chest. That matters, deeply, both for myself and for the families who lost loved ones to a sickness someone else caused. But I did not come here tonight to reclaim my mark, or my old position, or anything else Frostmoor once offered me. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Grace saw Nathaniel's expression shift, though he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. I came here, Grace said, because justice deserved to be spoken aloud, properly, by the person it happened to, rather than left as quiet rumor and half-finished apology. I came here because those who died deserved to hear directly that I never stopped trying to save them, and I came here because I needed to see, with my own eyes, that this pack has actually changed, rather than simply regretting its mistake after the fact. She paused, gathering her thoughts carefully before continuing, aware that whatever she said next would settle, permanently, the question that had followed her since Nathaniel first rode into Havenwood weeks earlier. What I have built since my banishment, Grace continued, is not something I'm willing to simply set aside, even for a crown I once might have wanted more than anything else in this world. I have a home now. I have people who chose me, and each other, freely, without ancient bloodline obligation or fear of banishment hanging over every decision we make together. I built that from nothing, in the depths of winter, with my own hands, and my own stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. Nathaniel's expression had grown very still, though Grace could see, even in the torchlight, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes carried an understanding of exactly where her words were leading, even before she spoke the final decision aloud. I am not yet ready to give you my answer about the crown, Grace said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Not here. Not before this crowd. not as part of a public ceremony meant to formally close this chapter. That conversation belongs to the two of us alone, Nathaniel, away from council chambers and gathered crowds, once I've had the chance to think clearly about everything this pack, and everything Havenwood, actually means to me now. Nathaniel nodded slowly, understanding clearly written across his exhausted features, though something like renewed hope flickered there as well. Hope Grace was not yet certain she wanted to encourage, however much a part of her still remembered the warmth of quiet summer evenings on the Healing Hall steps, long before any of this had happened between them. "Then I'll wait," Nathaniel said simply, "for as long as you need, to hear whatever answer you decide to give." The crowd dispersed slowly afterward, murmuring amongst themselves about the healer who had returned only to refuse the very crown that would have restored everything Frostmore had once taken from her. And Grace found herself standing alone in the square as the torches burned low, Ethan waiting patiently near the edge of the crowd, giving her the space she needed to process everything the evening had finally settled, and everything it had only just begun to unsettle in its place. Nathaniel was waiting alone by the Healing Hall steps when Grace finally sought him out the following morning, exactly where their quiet conversations had once unfolded on warm summer evenings, long before any of this had begun between them. "You found the same spot," Grace said, approaching slowly, taking in the way morning light fell across the familiar wooden steps, the Healing Hall behind them quiet and still, in a way it never had been during her years tending it. "I thought about waiting somewhere else," Nathaniel admitted, rising as she approached, though he did not close the careful distance between them. But this felt like the only honest place to have this conversation. Grace settled onto the steps, and after a moment's hesitation, Nathaniel joined her, though he left more space between them than he once would have. A small, deliberate acknowledgement of exactly how much had changed since they had last sat here together. "I've thought about what you said last night," Nathaniel began, "about Havenwood, about the life you've built there. I understand now, more clearly than I did when I rode into that hollow weeks ago, that I wasn't simply offering you a crown you once might have wanted. I was asking you to set aside something you built entirely without me, something that exists precisely because I failed you so completely." "That's part of it," Grace agreed quietly, "but it's not the whole truth of what I've been considering." Nathaniel turned to look at her fully. "Tell me the rest, then." Grace took a slow breath, choosing her words with the same careful precision she had once brought to mixing herbs for a difficult remedy. "When you cast me out that night," she said, "I believed, for a long time, that my entire worth depended on Frostmore's approval. On your approval, specifically. I thought losing this pack meant losing everything that made me who I was, my purpose, my skills, my place in the world." "And now?" Nathaniel asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "Now I know that isn't true," Grace said. "I built Havenwood, without any of Frostmore's structure, without ancient bloodline authority, without a crown, or a council, or even a proper pack bond holding it together. I built it because I refused to believe that losing this place meant losing myself. And in doing that, I discovered something I don't think I ever would have found if I had simply remained here, safe and comfortable, tending your Healing Hall for the rest of my life." "What did you discover?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "That I don't need to be chosen by someone else's crown to know my own worth," Grace said. "That the version of myself who might have accepted your offer without hesitation, who might have felt grateful simply to be wanted again after everything that happened, that version of me doesn't exist anymore. Havenwood didn't just give me a new home, Nathaniel. It gave me back the parts of myself Frostmore's justice tried to strip away that night in the snow." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the fields beyond the Healing Hall, fields Grace remembered from countless mornings gathering herbs before the sun had fully risen. "I understand," he said finally, though the words carried clear pain beneath their steady delivery. "I think, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me already understood this, the moment you stood before that crowd last night and refused to give your answer publicly. You were never going to simply return to what we once had, were you?" "No," Grace said gently, though she made herself meet his eyes directly as she said it. "I care about you, Nathaniel. I think some part of me always will, given everything we once shared before that terrible night. But I cannot build my future on a foundation that includes the memory of you standing silent while this pack tore my mark away, watching me dragged into the snow, and choosing political safety over standing beside someone you claimed to care for." "I know," Nathaniel said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet, aching acceptance that told Grace he had already begun preparing himself for exactly this answer, however much he had hoped otherwise. I made that choice. I have to live with what it cost, and I understand now that what it cost includes any future between the two of us, no matter how much I might wish otherwise. A king who chooses political safety over the person he cares about once, Grace said quietly, will always carry that possibility within him, even with the best intentions to change. I'm not willing to build a life wondering if the next crisis might reveal that same failure again, however much you've grown, however genuinely you regret what happened. Nathaniel absorbed this in silence, his expression carrying none of the wounded pride Grace had half expected, only a deep, weary acknowledgement that seemed to settle something long unresolved between them. Then what happens now? He asked finally. Between Frostmoor and Havenwood? Between you and me, if not as what I once hoped we might become? I would like Havenwood to remain at peace with Frostmoor, Grace said. Perhaps even an alliance, if you're willing. There's no reason our two communities cannot support each other, trade with each other, exist as neighbors rather than strangers, separated by old wounds that no longer need to define us. I would like that too, Nathaniel said, and something like genuine relief crossed his exhausted features, as though the possibility of losing Grace entirely, of never seeing her again beyond this single, difficult conversation, had weighed on him as heavily as the crown itself. Frostmoor owes Havenwood far more than simple peaceful coexistence, given everything this pack's failures cost you. Whatever support you need, resources, trade agreements, protection if Ashwood or any other pack threatens your settlement again, you have only to ask. Grace nodded, grateful for the offer, though she understood it came now, not from romantic hope, but from genuine remorse and respect, exactly the foundation a lasting peace between their two communities would need to survive. Thank you, she said, for understanding, for not fighting my answer, even though I know it isn't the one you hoped to hear. You taught me something important, Nathaniel said quietly, standing before that crowd last night, refusing to let gratitude or old feeling push you into a decision that wasn't fully your own. I think, whatever happens between us personally, Frostmoor will be a better pack for having witnessed that. Grace's law wasn't the only lesson your banishment taught this council. Watching you choose your own worth over easy restoration taught something I suspect this pack needed to learn just as badly. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the morning sun climbing higher over the fields, and Grace found herself feeling, for the first time since Nathaniel had ridden into Havenwood weeks earlier, a settled clarity that had nothing to do with anger or lingering hurt, only the quiet satisfaction of having spoken her truth fully and been heard without argument or manipulation in return. When she finally rose to leave, to find Ethan and begin the journey back toward the settlement that had become her true home, Nathaniel remained seated on the healing hall steps, watching her go, with an expression that carried grief, certainly, but also something like genuine peace, the peace of a man who had finally, fully, faced the consequences of his choices, and found, in facing them honestly, a strange kind of freedom he had not expected to discover. Safe travels, Grace Whitmore, he called after her, and there was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet respect for exactly who she had become. Safe rule, Nathaniel Ashford, Grace answered, turning back briefly to offer him a small, genuine smile, before continuing on toward the tree line, toward Ethan waiting patiently at the village edge, toward the settlement and the life and the future she had built entirely on her own hard-won terms. Ethan straightened as she approached, searching her face carefully for whatever answer the morning had brought, though he asked nothing directly, giving her the same patient space he had offered since the night he first found her collapsed in the snow. How did it go? He asked finally, once they had put the village well behind them and started along the path toward the tree line. I told him no, Grace said simply. Not out of anger, not out of spite. I told him I've built something too important to set aside, and that trust, once broken in a moment that mattered most, isn't something I'm willing to gamble on rebuilding, however genuine his regret. Something shifted visibly in Ethan's expression, relief mixed with a careful restraint, as though he were still holding back whatever he truly felt about her answer, out of respect for how significant the decision had been for her alone. How do you feel? He asked instead. Lighter, Grace admitted, surprising herself with how true the word felt as she said it aloud. Like I finally closed a door I didn't realize I'd been leaving open this entire time, waiting to see whether I'd walk back through it if given the chance. They walked together in comfortable silence for a while, the spring air growing warmer with every mile that separated them from Frostmoor's borders, birdsong filling the forest around them, in a way Grace hadn't noticed on the journey there, too consumed by nerves and old grief to appreciate the world waking up around her. "Can I tell you something?" Ethan asked eventually, breaking the quiet as they paused to rest beside a stream, swollen with melting snow. "Always," Grace said. "Watching you stand in that square last night," Ethan said, refusing to give your answer publicly, refusing to let gratitude or old feeling rush you into a decision that wasn't fully yours. "I understood something about you I don't think I fully appreciated before, even after everything we've built together this past winter." "What's that?" Grace asked softly. "That you would have been an extraordinary queen, if that's the life you had chosen," Ethan said. "But you're something far rarer than that. You're a woman who built her own kingdom from nothing, and chose it, deliberately, over one that was simply handed to her." He reached for her hand, the gesture as natural now as it had felt weeks earlier by the settlement well, though it carried a new certainty this time, unclouded by the uncertainty of Nathaniel's unresolved offer hanging between them. "I meant what I said before you left for Frostmoor, Grace. Whatever you decided about that crown, I wanted you to know how I felt. But I'm glad, selfishly perhaps, that your answer leaves room for whatever we might build together going forward." Grace turned to face him fully, the stream rushing quietly beside them, the forest bright with the first true green of spring pushing up through winter's retreating grip. "I didn't refuse Nathaniel's offer because of you," she said honestly. "I need you to know that. I refused it because I've become someone who no longer needs a crown, or anyone's approval, to know my own worth." "I know," Ethan said, a faint smile crossing his face. "That's exactly why I'm glad." Grace laughed then, a genuine unguarded laugh that surprised even herself with how freely it came, and Ethan's smile widened in response, something warm and certain passing between them that had been building slowly, carefully, through months of shared hardship and quiet companionship neither of them had rushed to name too quickly. "Come on," Grace said finally, squeezing his hand before releasing it to continue along the path. "Havenwood is waiting, and I imagine Clara has already organized 3 new defense drills and reorganized the entire storage shed in our absence." "Probably 4 drills," Ethan said, falling into step beside her, knowing Clara. They continued on together through the brightening spring morning, leaving Frostmoor and its unresolved crown behind them, carrying instead the quiet, settled certainty of a choice fully made, a future fully chosen, and a partnership that had grown, slowly and honestly, into something neither of them intended to let slip away now that it had finally been spoken aloud between them. A full year had passed since the night Grace Whitmore was cast out into the snow, and the hollow that had once sheltered a handful of desperate exiles now hummed with the steady activity of a settlement that had grown into something far larger than anyone could have imagined during that first brutal winter. Havenwood had nearly tripled in size. New cabins lined the hollow's edges, built by hands that had once belonged to a dozen different packs before finding their way to this place of second chances. A proper healing hall now stood at the settlement's center, larger and better stocked than the one Grace had once tended in Frostmoor, its shelves organized with the same careful precision she had always brought to her craft, though this time, every decision about its construction, its supplies, its purpose, had been entirely her own. Grace stood at the hall's entrance on a warm spring morning, watching Lucy, now fully healed and training seriously under her guidance, carefully measuring out herbs for a young traveler who had arrived only the week before, fleeing a pack that had decided his stutter made him unsuitable for their ranks. It was a scene that had become almost routine now, new arrivals finding their way to Havenwood through the same quiet network of travelers and traders that had once carried news of Grace's own banishment across the neutral territories. "You're smiling," Clara observed, joining her at the doorway with a satisfied glance toward the training exercise Lucy was conducting with a small group of younger settlement members nearby, teaching them basic defense in case Ashwood, or any other pack, ever decided the threat Damon Voss had once made was worth carrying out after all. "I was just thinking about how different this all looks now," Grace admitted, "from that first night when it was only Ethan's cabin and a few scattered furs against the cold. Speaking of Ethan, Clara said, a knowing smile playing at the corner of her mouth. He's been looking for you all morning. Something about wanting to show you what he's been building near the eastern ridge. Grace felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest at the mention of his name, a warmth that had only grown steadier and more certain over the past year, through countless shared decisions about the settlement's growth, quiet evenings by the fire, and the slow, deliberate building of a partnership neither of them had rushed, but both had chosen with complete certainty, once the choice had finally been made clear. She found him at the eastern ridge exactly where Clara had directed, standing before a newly constructed cabin, larger and sturdier than any of the others in the settlement, its timber frame catching the morning light in a way that made it look, for a moment, almost golden against the surrounding forest. "What is this?" Grace asked, though something in Ethan's expression, careful and hopeful all at once, told her he had built this with a purpose, far more specific than simple settlement expansion. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, "about what comes next for us. For Havenwood. For everything we've built together this past year." He gestured toward the cabin behind him. "I wanted us to have something that was truly ours, separate from the healing hall, separate from the council chamber, a place that belongs to exactly the life we've chosen to build together." Grace stepped closer, taking in the careful craftsmanship of the cabin's construction, the deliberate placement of windows to catch the morning sun, details that spoke of months of careful planning, rather than a hasty addition to the settlement's growing structures. "Ethan," she said softly, understanding, beginning to dawn, even before he spoke his next words. "I love you, Grace Whitmore," Ethan said, turning to face her fully, his usual careful reserve giving way completely to open, unguarded honesty. "I have for longer than I think. Either of us was ready to admit, through that first terrible winter. Through Nathaniel's offer of a crown you refused without hesitation. Through every single day since that, I've watched you build something extraordinary, out of the wreckage this world tried to hand you instead. I'm not offering you a crown. I'm not offering you power, or bloodline, or ancient pack law. I'm only offering you exactly what I have, a life built alongside yours, for as long as you'll have me." Grace felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the grief and desperation of that terrible night in the Frostmoor Square, only a full, overwhelming joy that seemed to fill every corner of her chest at once. "You already gave me everything that mattered," she said, "the night you found me half frozen in the snow and decided I was worth saving, even though you owed me nothing at all." "Is that a yes?" Ethan asked, a hopeful smile breaking through his careful composure. "That's an absolute yes," Grace said, closing the distance between them. And the kiss that followed carried within it everything they had built together over the past year, patience and trust, and the slow, deliberate choosing of a partnership neither of them had rushed, but both had known, with quiet certainty, was exactly what they wanted, for whatever years remained ahead of them. News of their engagement spread through Havenwood before the day was finished, and the settlement celebrated that evening with a gathering around the central fire, larger than any Grace had witnessed since the community's earliest days, every member of the growing settlement bringing whatever small offering they could manage, shared food, songs half-remembered from packs long left behind, laughter that echoed warmly against the surrounding hills. Word eventually reached Frostmoor as well, carried by Simon on one of his regular trading visits, and Nathaniel sent a formal letter of congratulations, only weeks later, along with a generous gift of supplies, for the settlement's continued growth, a gesture Grace understood, carried genuine goodwill, rather than any lingering hope of reconsideration. Frostmoor and Havenwood had settled, over the past year, into exactly the peaceful alliance Grace had once proposed on the Healing Hall steps, trade flowing steadily between the two communities, Nathaniel ruling with a humility and careful investigation of every serious accusation that Grace's law had permanently woven into Frostmoor's council proceedings. Colin Ashford, Grace had heard through occasional reports, had settled somewhere far to the south, living a quiet, solitary existence that carried none of the ambition or jealousy that had once driven him to nearly destroy everything his brother's pack had built. Grace found she carried no bitterness toward him any longer, only a distant, settled understanding that his actions, however cruel, had ultimately led her toward a life far richer than anything she might have built had she remained safely, unquestioningly, within Frostmoor's borders. On the evening of her wedding, held in Havenwood's central clearing beneath a sky full of stars neither pack law nor ancient bloodline had any claim over. Grace stood beside Ethan and looked out at the gathered settlement, at Clara, and Edward, and Lucy, and dozens of others who had found their way to this hollow through exactly the kind of loss and rejection that had once nearly broken her completely. She thought of the woman who had been dragged into that snow-filled square a year earlier, desperate and pleading for a mercy that never came, and she found she carried no regret at all for the path that had led her from that terrible night to this one. Frostmore's crown had once seemed like everything she could ever want. Standing here now, surrounded by a family built entirely on choice rather than obligation, beside a man who had chosen her freely and completely, Grace understood that she had found something far more valuable than any throne Nathaniel Ashford could have offered her. She had found herself, fully and completely, in the wreckage of what should have destroyed her, and she had built, from that wreckage, a kingdom entirely her own. The fire crackled warmly against the spring night, and as Ethan took her hand to begin their first dance, as partners bound not by ancient pack law, but by their own deliberate, hard-won choice, Grace Whitmore, healer, leader, and founder of Havenwood, understood with complete certainty that whatever winters still lay ahead, she would face them exactly as she had learned to face every hardship since that terrible night in the snow, with strength entirely her own, and a home built to last. Clara had organized the ceremony with the same fierce efficiency she brought to every task, arranging wildflowers gathered from the eastern ridge into simple, beautiful arrangements along the clearing's edge, while Edward had spent the better part of 2 weeks building a small wooden arch beneath which Grace and Ethan now stood, carved with symbols the settlement had chosen together, rather than inherited from any single pack's tradition. An open hand representing welcome, a small flame representing the fire that had first brought them all together, as strangers seeking warmth against the cold. Lucy, now confident and capable in ways that would have seemed impossible the night Grace first found her bleeding and afraid in the forest, stood as the ceremony's officiant, having asked for the honor months earlier when the engagement was first announced. "Havenwood exists," Lucy said to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, despite the nervous tremor she couldn't quite suppress, because 2 people decided that kindness mattered more than caution, that healing mattered more than fear, and that a home built on choice could be stronger than any home built on obligation. She turned to Grace and Ethan, love and gratitude clear in her expression. "I stand here today because Grace chose to help a stranger she owed nothing to. I stand here because Ethan chose to save a woman the world had already decided to throw away. Whatever they build together now, I know it will carry that same choice forward, for as long as Havenwood exists." The vows that followed were simple, unadorned by ancient pact ceremony, Grace and Ethan speaking directly to each other, rather than reciting inherited words neither of them had chosen. Grace promised to keep building, alongside him, a place where no one need fear being cast aside for their weakness or their difference. Ethan promised to remain exactly what he had been since the night he found her in the snow, steady, honest, and unwilling to let fear dictate what mercy required of him. When the ceremony concluded, the entire settlement erupted into celebration that stretched long into the night. Music carried by instruments some of the settlers had crafted themselves, food prepared from months of careful harvest and trade, laughter echoing across the hollow, in a way that would have seemed impossible during that first desperate winter, when survival alone had felt like the only achievable goal. Simon arrived partway through the celebration, having timed his trading route deliberately to witness the occasion, and brought with him not just goods for trade, but a letter from Nathaniel, delivered with careful discretion, so as not to overshadow the joy of the evening. Grace read it privately, later that night, once the celebration had quieted and Ethan had fallen asleep beside her in the new cabin they now shared. The letter was brief, carrying none of the longing or regret of his earlier correspondence, only genuine warmth and well wishes for the life she had chosen. He wrote that Frostmore continued to thrive under the reforms her banishment had ultimately inspired, that Grace's law remained firmly woven into the council's proceedings, that he had begun, slowly, to consider what kind of leader he wanted to become, now that fear no longer dictated his choices as completely as it once had. He wrote, too, that he had finally begun to understand what Grace meant that morning on the Healing Hall steps, that some kinds of trust, once broken, could not simply be rebuilt through good intention alone, and that he was grateful, despite everything, that she had taught him this lesson, before it cost anyone else what it had once cost her. Grace folded the letter carefully, and set it aside, feeling not the ache of old wounds reopened, but the quiet satisfaction of a chapter fully closed, resolved not through bitterness or lingering resentment, but through honest acknowledgement on both sides of exactly what had been lost, and exactly what had been gained in its place. She turned to look at Ethan sleeping peacefully beside her, at the cabin he had built with such careful intention, at the life they had chosen together entirely on their own terms, and felt, more strongly than she had ever felt anything in her life, that she had found something Frostmore's crown could never have offered her, a home built not on inherited obligation, but on deliberate, daily choice, renewed freely by two people who understood exactly what it meant to be cast aside, and had built, from that pain, something neither of them intended to ever let go. Outside, Havenwood settled into its usual quiet nighttime rhythm, the settlement she had built from nothing but stubborn hope and hard-won skill, continuing its steady, determined growth beneath a sky full of stars that belonged to no pack, no crown, and no ancient law, only to the people who had chosen, freely and completely, to call this hollow home. And Grace Whitmore, once cast out into winter, with nothing but a thin cloak and a wound where her pack mark used to be, closed her eyes that night and slept peacefully, fully certain, for the first time since that terrible night in the snow, that she had finally, completely, found exactly where she belonged.